Thank you everyone for joining. Just to give a bit of context, this is a session hosted by Newfoundation and also NEWFORUM. So we have some of our hosts here from NEWFORUM today who are going to help to guide the conversation, as well as Dominique, who has been focusing a lot around this topic that we're here for today for transmedia fashion. And so she will explain very well and very deeply what this conversation is really going to be about on this topic. And after we've done the main session with the conversations from our key speakers, we're going to have an audience participation session. So Dominique, over to you to moderate and give us more context on our topic today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Maddie, for the introduction. My name is Dominique. I will be moderating the panel. I am the lead researcher for the Transmedia Fashion Research Group here in Newfoundation. And I am very happy to have you all here in the kickoff open panel with amazing guests, Tony, Sam, and Sofiane. I will take 1 minute to introduce the terms so we can start from there. We understand transmedia fashion as this wide range of aspects that intersect with fashion, and including technologies and social media, Web3, the metaverse, gaming, internet culture. So we talk about fashion in a wider way, right? So it's a discipline that unfolds in all of those perspectives, and also it goes beyond just garment creation and beyond clothing. So we understand transmedia fashion also as this interconnected web of creators and, kind of like a matrix of different narratives. I don't want to go too much in depth. We have one of the panel ahead to be talking about that. But we have recently published an article that is called A Notebook on Media and Clothes. It's a tribute to Wim Wenders' documentary that is called A Notebook on Cities and Clothes. If you haven't seen it, please go ahead and see it, because in that article we talk about aspiration economy that we will be diving into with Sofiane in a little bit, and what we think about how fashion intertwines with history and the way that it unfolds into what we think about it now. So please go ahead and take a look. Also, you can collect it because it's on Mirror, so you can do that too. And without further ado, we're going to jump in our first question. Maybe let's start with Tony, and that is, what's your background and what does transmedia fashion mean in your line of work and why it is important?
Exciting. All right. Well, hey, everyone. My name is Tony. I am the founder of the independent strategy practice called the Office of Applied Strategy. We've been around for, past 2-3 years, so kind of born out of the pandemic. Prior to that, I worked for over a decade for various tech and fashion houses. I actually have a McKinsey background, and then I went to Google, so a bit of a more traditional corporate background, and then randomly decided I wanted to actually get a medical degree. So I went back to college and got a master's in bioethics. But a lot of that is sort of the anthropology of the biosciences. And a lot of the course was actually very critical theory and sort of anthropology oriented. And it made me really realize that so much of culture today is just sort of applied anthropology, and a lot of brand strategy is just applied corporate anthropology. So eventually I just kind of ended up in the fashion industry working in Europe for various houses. And then the kind of most formative, experience prior to starting my agency was Essence. So I was at Essence for 3 years, where I was director of content, then eventually director of brand strategy for Essence. And I built the entire content platform at Essence. So when I started, Essence was only publishing 1 to 3 times a week. There were only 4 people in the organization. They had just hired Yor Koch, who is the founder and editor-in-chief of 032C, as the editor-in-chief of Essence. And I basically built it to what it is today across every channel. And so that was kind of like the core experience. Eventually moved to New York and started my own practice. OMAS is basically an independent practice that is purely focused on strategy. And how I like to describe it is that we're an anti-disciplinary sort of practice that typically works on what I call N of one problems or N1 problems, which is to say that they're sort of the first of their kind. So typically, because we take a hybrid management consulting meets sort of creative strategy type approach, we kind of operate in this kind of weird gap between sort of what an MBB firm might do, like McKinsey, Bain, BCG, sort of financial modeling, business development, so on and so forth. But then what a pentagram and 2x4 might do in terms of like cultural forecasting and campaign concepting and whatnot. And so that allows us to do some really interesting stuff with clients. For example, we worked with Sequoia, the venture capital fund, on crypto outreach to help them improve deal flow and build cultural credibility with other Web3 startups. This was early last year when times were good. So, they pivoted their approach since, just given the macroeconomic conditions. Also worked with like Nike on a strategy for a holiday. Can't really talk more about that because, they haven't launched it yet, but just being able to get the brief, like, hey, we want to invent a holiday, like an Amazon Prime kind of thing, and we want it to be a cultural moment, an annual celebration. What is the strategy for building a holiday? And what is the cultural narrative for an annual holiday? Working with Ariana Grande on metaverse research in a very broad sense. And this was before her Fortnite collab, where she became like an in-skin avatar and, did her collab with the video game. Or even Valentino working on their ambassador program. And, one of the big unlocks being, hey, your ambassadors don't have to be real people, right? And so they did a whole Animal Crossing collab around that time period. So, being able to work on these sorts of strategic challenges that really disrupt the paradigm, whether it's a cultural, social narrative or a fundamental business model. The last project I'll just mention is I worked with David Zwerner, the blue chip art gallery, and I helped them work on their e-com strategy, like next gen e-com. And, e-com at this point is nothing that new. It's sort of table stakes for most verticals, but in the world of contemporary art for primary inventory, so not like auction houses, you can't go online. It's not DTC. You can't just like go and buy a Yayoi Kusama pumpkin with your credit card. You have to go through, a sales director. You have to go through the gallery. It's a very in-person experience. And so David Zwerner worked with OAS on building the next gen strategy for what eventually DTC e-com sales for an art gallery could look like. And one of the results of that strategy was the creation of platform.art. Platform Art is sort of a new venture by David Zwerner. It's not branded David Zwerner, but it's basically the world's first DTC art marketplace where all the art is like first come, first serve. You buy in your credit card. And it's long tail art. So that is to say the art is under $50,000, which in the art world is considered cheaper inventory. And it's all from like emerging galleries around the world, but they're all hand selected by David Zwerner. So that's sort of like a business model kind of innovation, because the gesture of like DTC ecom in the art world is a pretty radical gesture. Onto the second point, which is like, how does transmedia sort of content frame and inform the work that I do? Ultimately, a lot of the work that we do is working with brands on world building, and transmedia content really allows you to approach storytelling in entirely new modes, and just to also really think about the fundamental shifts in which the relationship and hierarchy between culture and commerce is imploding into just this amorphous goo. For the history of kind of, civilization of mankind, there's always been a very kind of like specific relationship between the kind of capital markets and then the cultural markets. People with commercial capital chase after culture. And so they try to buy their way into culture. And then the people who are generating culture typically don't have as much, commercial capital. And so they're courting the money from the commercial kind of capital markets. And so you have this kind of circular sort of model. In some ways, you could also cynically call it quite parasitic or be a bit more cynical about that. But fundamentally, commerce and culture were always like kind of two different spheres that had this sort of relationship. But increasingly, I think we're seeing the two imploding. And on a more micro level, I think the very sort of relationship between channels, like what is like a storytelling channel versus what is a sales channel, it's also imploding. And I think a lot of the work that I do is very much kind of meta and trying to hijack formats and channels to tell different kinds of stories, and leveraging sort of different ways of trying to kind of make things a little bit more participatory or a bit more sort of multi-layered. And that's ultimately a lot of the kind of thinking that went into the work that I did with Prada. So I did all the strategy for Prada's runway shows and campaigns for around 2.5 seasons. I worked with Ferdinando Verderi, the creative director, on that. So I started when Raf debuted his women's wear show think that was spring, summer 21. For the runway show, the big contribution was a Q&A that happened after the show. So Mrs. Prada and Raf sat together and answered questions from people around the world. So that was my contribution. And so the kind of interesting sort of prompt was, they were like, Raf's just joined, and, we had this broader question of how do we continue to maintain the exclusivity of Prada as a brand, but we're seen as very cold and aloof. How do we become more accessible as a brand? And so, part of the idea was, well, typically when a new designer starts at a brand, especially one as like cult as Raf, the exclusive that you do after the first show as a designer Q&A is a big PR hook. And we were like, okay, what if we don't give that to a Wall Street Journal or an M. Le Monde or, a Vogue? What if we actually just opened it to the world and we made it an AMA, which again, in 2020 actually, because we were doing this idea in 2020 for the show, AMAs are not that revolutionary, but for people in the luxury industry, many of whom are not on Reddit, they're like, oh, that's really like interesting. But the real big thing here is that this is an idea that only worked for Prada because Prada is such a cerebral brand, and the community that it has cultivated is just as cerebral and is dedicated to the intellectual explorations of Prada as a brand. You could not imagine a Q&A with Dolce & Gabbana having the kind of questions that were asked to Raf and Miuccia. And the questions that we got were so thoughtful, and the language barrier aspect actually made it so interesting. Like, one of the questions that they answered is, what is the Prada-ness? And that was the question. It was from someone in Japan. And I think that like element of like clearly not a native English speaker asking the question, what is the Prada-ness, to Raf and Miuccia provoked some very interesting responses. And again, this, was the most watched show in the history of Prada. I think 13 times more than the second most watched show. Got a lot of immediate traction. It actually informed the basis of our campaign for spring summer, where we reversed the hierarchy, where we ask questions to the world. So that was a campaign where you see questions written on the assets, and people could submit their answers. But fundamentally for me, that's an example of sort of transmedia content, because you're essentially using the runway show in a campaign as a bi-directional media tool. Typically, especially in luxury, the campaign, the runway show is very unidirectional. It is a very top-down communication method of setting the agenda and trying to kind of influence sort of the consumers. It is not a two-way dialogue. But with Prada, we were like, what if we actually turn these moments into dialogues, into moments for bi-directional communication? And so that was a risk that they're willing to take. It turned out really successful, and that was really exciting. And I think that's, an example of how transmedia content has been a very interesting sort of strand in a lot of the investigations and kind of work that we do, because fundamentally, I'm not really interested in working on things that uphold the status quo. And so I think with a lot of campaign work that I do, if I'm not disrupting a social narrative, which is also part of something I really like doing, then, how do we at least subvert the modes by which we consume content and engage with content? I think Matches Fashion is another really cool example of something we got to do, where we got to kind of play in this more meta transmedia way, where like things are very multi-layered. So we did Matches Fashion's first Korea campaign. This was 2 years ago, I think at this point. And so our whole concept was actually taking from the phenomena of audition culture in Korea. So, in Korea, the entertainment industry is a lot more sort of corporatized. And, people who want to be pop stars have to audition from a very young age, and they train at a very young age. So the act of auditioning is a very kind of broad cultural phenomenon in Korea that is very specific to that market. And so for our campaign, we worked with a series of K-pop stars and actors and actresses and models. So one of the biggest talents we got was Sunmi, the K-pop star. And the campaign, which is very Prada-like, it's like the campaign is not the campaign. The campaign is sort of like documentation of something that becomes the campaign, like the flower campaign, the auction campaign with Sotheby's. And so with Matches, it was basically like, it was an audition poster, and we asked people to audition for the real Matches Fashion campaign. And then we shot another campaign with real people who auditioned, and they submitted their applications on social media. But, this idea of like, how do we connect digital and physical? How do we kind of storytell across space and time? And how do we kind of instead of it being sort of this more traditional hierarchy of like, you have your campaign, you get a big photographer like a Merton Marcus to shoot it, and then you copy paste, or you sort of trickle down content economics across different channels. It's more of this like, how do we actually think about every content channel on its own right as being its own protagonist, and kind of create these more like multi-layered narrative arcs that require you to actually go across these different channels to participate, but you can still like kind of pop in at any moment and still like enjoy the experience as it is. Like, you know, it can credibly stand on its own, regardless of whether you see it on one channel or another, but you can kind of follow it as it unfolds throughout, you know, the season. I'll stop there.
Yeah.
And, you know, kind of, we can go deeper, but that's just sort of me in a nutshell.
That's amazing. And, you know, we could keep on going forever because I spotted out like some amazing things that you were saying along the way. And I feel, you know, it's a lot about how, you know, you mentioned being a little bit disruptive, but also elegant, right? So how you pick those small cues or like small strings that you need to pull a little bit to expand the ecosystem and expand the storytelling of each one of those brands. And also, you know, take that small leap of faith, because there's also something that is really important about that. It's like you can investigate everything, but also it's about taking some risks, right? So I always think about this effort of going from 0 to 1, from like, you know, taking that first acceleration moment where you actually take action. And, you know, it's one of the most difficult parts where you trust your gut and you trust the like the mapping that you did and you go ahead and do it. So I believe you have been extremely successful on that, and and to do that, trusting the future is because you do a really intense mapping of the present, right? It's like you study the present so hard that you can actually trust yourself, trust your gut when doing those expanded storytellings. But you know, it's really interesting, and we can still go deeper after. You know, I would love Sam's answer and then Sofiane's. So Sam, I will pass you the microphone, and if you can tell us a little bit more about your background and, you know, why transmedia fashion is relevant in your field of work. And thank you, Tony.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll go quick because it's true that there's like at least a few good topics there that I just want to like hop on at some point. So I'll go quickly. I've been working in computer graphics for like close to 10 years now. I do art direction. I'm generally a 3D artist and a visual artist to start with. So what I find interesting is we all come from really different backgrounds. Like I didn't come from fashion. I came from, well, visual arts. That's what I studied, and then I graduated in psychology. So kind of a little bit all over the place, and hadn't touched 3D up until around 2014 when VR started becoming a real thing. I read about it on Reddit and I was like, oh, this is a real thing, so I'll go try it out. And by this point, it was like a very, you know, development kit, kind of like a real sketchy kind of box that you put on your face. And for me, that like, and I was, you know, in my mid-20s, so I was doing visual arts, painting, graphic design, stuff like that. And so my exposure to virtual reality sort of jump-started this whole interest in working in 3D. So by this point, I didn't have any experience in 3D. It wasn't really like my background or my métier. So I kind of just jumped in really hard and started working with John Rathman, who's also in Montreal, very early on, and sort of like jumped directly in the ocean without any preconception. 10 years later, after having just basically almost trying to get back to shore, you know, sort of like in the middle of the ocean at night, getting back into shore, I've learned a lot since then. So I've been working, in the past, I've worked more in real time doing VR, augmented reality, stuff like that, installations, immersive installations. And now it's become just more globally like videos, animations, in fashion a lot lately, which I think is sort of like an incidental collaboration between, I don't know, kind of like like-minded industries. I mean, one of the reasons why I think I'm working in fashion now is just because the ideas are typically very bold. It's fairly forward-thinking despite like some nostalgic elements, but it's very, you know, it's usually like, here's a crazy idea. We're coming to a CGI person to expand on the idea. So for me, it's always been, I think, a pretty natural kind of inclination, which has really jump-started in the past few years. As a visual artist, my interest has always been on the body and how you define the body. I mean, you mentioned, I think the boundaries of the body and how fashion sort of, you know, that overlap between, where you define the boundaries. And I think in screen space and on the internet, you have a very fragmented idea of the body. So how fashion responds to that, I think, is like my main interest.
That's great. That's great. I love it because also, you know, I feel very related to your field of work because I come from a similar place. And, you know, it's interesting because you talk about how you got into fashion, and I feel like fashion went to you, right? It knocked you the door.
Yeah.
They like, hey, we need new mediums, right? We need your expertise. We're short on everything else. Like, this is not enough. So we are starting to need, AR and VR and 3D and, expanding into also immersive installations, and it's very much needed, right? You are kind of like the visual translator of everything else, and it takes a lot. I feel like everything that we're going to be talking today, it needs a lot of courage to do it, because it's, working a little bit in the dark. It's working a little bit in uncertainty and trying to translate the needs of someone on actual thing, right?
Yeah, that's been a pretty consistent theme, I think, across my work with fashion designers, is that there's a need to onboard people who don't work in CGI. And because it's such a massive technical world. So I think that me coming from a background that is not CGI in general, from like programming, etc., I'm like kind of in a pretty good position to provide a pretty smooth transition into this kind of world. And I think what you mentioned, I mean, Tony, at one point you mentioned world building. I think that there's an emphasis on this idea of defining new narratives with world building, with new forms of media, different channels, etc. So an exciting time.
What you mentioned about onboarding people, it happens the same way with Web3. Like, there's this need to guide people to new disciplines and new ways of taking their expertise further. So with that being said, Sofiane, can you tell us a little bit more about your background and why transmedia fashion is important in everything that we're doing here also in Newfoundation?
Yeah, sure can. Thank you so much, guys. It was great to hear your backstory. On my side, so very briefly, I started right in the startup industry in the early 2000s. I got into music. At that time, it was Kazaa and Napster and so on. And we built a startup that was specializing in ringtones, because that was the only thing that people would pay for in music. So we were selling like $3 MIDI files for your phone. And the startup got acquired in 2005. Then moved to fashion a bit by accident. We built a 2.0 platform, and that was exactly at the time when Tumblr was starting to pop, and the bloggers. So there was a big hype around fashion bloggers. So that was the beginning of Web 2. And what's fascinating about this era, and I see a lot of parallels with the transition to Web 3, is that initially you had a small percentage of content creators who also happened to have some technical skills. So if you wanted to publish something online, let's say in 2005, 6, 7, you would have to know how to manipulate a 5D camera, the SD cards, Photoshop to resize the pictures by yourself, compress the files, upload them to a WordPress or all those blogging platforms. And then people would have to use RSS feeds to follow you. You couldn't just follow someone. You had to sign up for an RSS feed and then copy paste the RSS link. And it was super complex. So many manipulations, so many things had to be done to coordinate this content stream. And then for about 5 years, bloggers completely took over the space. They made, and we, because we were running a platform for bloggers, we made fashion editors mad, because we were basically taking things that they spent 20 years to build and suddenly catapulting kids who were 15 years old in the front row of the fashion shows and so on. And it was fascinating to me, and that's how I got into the anthropology of what's behind fashion, not from the experience itself, but from the analytics. So back to what Tony was talking about when he mentioned anthropology and first principles. So what is fashion? Deconstructing fashion was very exciting to me. And so basically my definition of transmedia fashion, I would say it's a combination of two main aspects. The first one is the definition of fashion as in the way of doing things. So there is fashion for clothing, which is what we know and we tend to primarily associate it with. And then there is fashion for web fonts, for colors, for subcultures. If you look at the hipster, for example, trend, it started with some skinny jeans and beards, and it ended up with like entire urbanism and completely new ways to build architecture, design, interior, barber shops popping everywhere, brands like Topshop or Starbucks selling, billions of dollars of coffee, but with this like hipster feel. So this is how I would define fashion, like much broader category that would actually even include technology and crypto and buzzwords and all of that. This idea that everything starts from the edge. You have like a small group, a small scene of people who start to do something weird. And that's usually how fashion works. You see someone like doing a fashion show with like completely insane outfits, and they are like, going viral because they are so disruptive. And then the next thing you know, like 10% of people have started to adopt it, and then 20, and then 100. And when it gets to 100, it's over. A famous quote from Karl Lagerfeld was, "The minute something becomes fashionable, it's no longer fashionable," something like that. And so that's the mechanism through which culture spreads, and culture, like the big category of culture. Yeah, when you look at electronic music, for example, initially it started as a skeuomorphic reproduction of instruments. Let's do a copy of the piano. Let's do a copy of the guitar. And then very quickly, people building those softwares realized that they could actually create the kind of sounds that were unique and that were very different. And that created a completely new category, a new subgenre. And so here we are now with Web 2 is kind of reaching like the end of an era. Now everyone is tired of those like feeds and desperately looking for something more fun to do than taking pictures of yourself, which has been all those years. I think a huge missed opportunity was Tumblr and its acquisition by Yahoo. So they bought basically Tumblr for $1 billion and they put banners on it. They put like regular banners, like for regular content. It was not even targeted. They just thought, oh, there is a nice inventory, let's buy it. I think that's a big problem in our society right now. That's probably the biggest challenge, is the valuation of things, because sometimes people will buy and sell things without really capturing like what has value about it. And so Tumblr was this amazing control laboratory where people would create mood boards and create their personal image, not by taking pictures of themselves, but by collecting all those visuals that they liked. And so what does it tell about you, about what's actually inside your brain, kind of displaying your brain as like a curatorial feed, a data trail of like all the things that you love? That's something that I see a lot resonating with the definition of transmedia fashion, because it's not clothing, it's not something that you wear, yet it tells a lot about your taste and about what you belong to. So yeah, now that we are entering, the end of the Web 2 era, curation models with like Pinterest and Tumblr, taking pictures of yourself on Instagram, making reels on TikTok and so on. What's next? And obviously what's next is ownership, and Web3 is inevitable. It's just going to happen no matter how much the world resists to it. There are some like first principles, fundamentals around it that will make it work. It's just a matter of time. So you have on one side ownership. You can own those universal bits of data called NFTs. And then you have all the possibilities of disruption of fashion, which can be a big category of that is obviously 3D and all those like formats around gaming, AR, XR, and so on. And then you have all the rest, all the things that are not necessarily looking like clothing, but that are derivatives of that. For example, Friends with Benefits, I consider them as a fashion brand in the sense that it has a lot of the characteristics of fashion. You want to belong, you buy something that allows you to be part of a certain community. It's like the key to enter a community, and it's just a token. And that token increases in value, but if it gets too popular, then its price should go up, which kind of regulates like how many people should belong to avoid this like 100%. That's a whole area that we can explore. There are lots of ramifications in terms of how we perceive our relationship with culture, our relationship with ownership, our relationship with community, with digital formats, and how this is all monetized. Not necessarily as like a speculative exercise like what we see with a lot happening in crypto, which is most people are just kind of playing the casino, like I'm going to buy this or that and try to find a way to sell it. But actually as something that a bit like the Tumblr feed, like you build your data signals all around you and you tokenize that and you create an economy around that. And The use cases and the infinity of possibilities, we have just started to scratch the surface. And yeah, super excited. One last comment about scratching the surface. I think what's going to happen, and back to like my trajectory before that, initially with music, we were basically selling catalogs for music majors. So we were working with like Warner, BMG, all those like EMI, Sony, and so on. Then what happened? So SoundCloud tried to disrupt music, but it was a Web 2 model. And at some point they kind of had to like turn into this like vending machine for big major catalogs. So they couldn't like disrupt that inner part of it. When you look at fashion, it's kind of similar. Fashion until now has been using the internet for publishing content, so promotion and distribution. So if you look at Farfetch and Instagram, Instagram is the platform for promoting your brand. Farfetch is the platform to sell. But those things are very on the surface. They are very like all the value chain is happening in the design studios, in the fashion weeks, in the showrooms, the stylists, all this like content production. It's all still completely analog. It's still completely offline. It's under NDAs with headhunters, very, very old school. It's not even digitized. It's like web -1. And those companies are held by conglomerates and groups that were built in the 80s, when the whole mentality and the whole business model was, how do we extract as much value as possible for our shareholders? Not that they are bad people, but that was the culture back then. It was the culture of like, like basic capitalism of like, let's concentrate wealth as much as possible. The world has changed since, but the leverage that those corporations have due to the physicality, let's say, of the industry, physicality of the real estate that they own, of the infrastructure, of the distribution, all of that, it has not been challenged yet by Web 2 because they were just selling ads to those industries. With Web 3, what could happen is the complete vaporization of the entire value chain from the first idea of a designer all the way to the end customer. And I think that's very exciting because it has so many implications.
Thank you, Sofiane. Yes, and while you were talking, I thought about how Web3 makes it a little bit easier to move from this analog method that we have had previously. And, by digitizing IP and digitizing all of your points of view and assets, it feels a little bit more heavy. It feels like you have something inside your kind of like social media closet, right? And I feel like that's something that also has to do a lot with the body and the avatar and the online persona by being a little bit heavier than the actual, physical person that is walking around the streets. And I was thinking, Tony, I think you mentioned something about digital avatars taking over, like the digital avatars revolution at some point in your forecast report that you did recently. And you talk about how users become avatars more easily without needing so much professional setup. So I was wondering if you can expand a little bit more around that. And also, maybe Sam, you can give your perspective on that. Like, where do the designer comes into that play, right?
Yeah, for sure. So just for context, Dominic's referencing a social media futures forecast that OAS published earlier this year as part of our think tank. We publish like, twice or three times a year. And then our site has all the other things. Like we did a project with Boston Consulting Group before that on like the future of luxuries. So they're all generally more kind of like futurism oriented and a bit more kind of like, looking at what's coming up in the near future. So one of the trends that we considered that I'm really interested in is sort of virtual avatars. Obviously, the metaverse is a massive buzzword, and even I'm averse to using that nowadays. But I think a lot about what is the entryway or like, almost like the plug into that, kind of thinking like, like with the Matrix or even Evangelion, like what is the actual interface in which you access it? And so I think a lot about the hardware and the fact that, you've got this sort of kind of influx of these sort of like CGI avatars like Little Michaela or Imagram, but they're actually run by agencies and teams. And for independent creators, it is not easy to basically kind of be a virtual avatar, like full body virtual avatar, because mocap suits are really expensive. And the setup is very daunting. But some of the VC funds that I've been talking to that are looking at Web3 and the passion economy have been thinking a lot about, about hardware and software, and they're taking a more agnostic approach to, we don't know people are going to enter through Meta or through Fortnite or through some other platform, but we want to create the underlying infrastructure. And because ultimately with any sort of technology, the infrastructure is far more important than the endpoint, as far as like the ability to scale it and to drive it and create mass adoption. So yeah, I think a lot about sort of the about how sort of like motion capture is like the technology is becoming cheaper. Sony actually released a new motion capture system called Mocappy earlier this year, and it is not super powerful, but its retail price is, I think, set at $400. So it's just a lot more accessible than prior generations. But I think the big thing that it's going to do is it's also going to explode the independent kind of scene with like virtual avatars. And I think, creators are going to lead the adoption for a lot of things going forward. And so as they adopt it more into sort of their programming and into their whole like shtick, it will make it easier for like mass markets to adopt as well. I think it's the same with AI. Like increasingly, I've seen like creators who are branding themselves as AI artists or AI creators. Like on LinkedIn for the first time last month, I saw someone change their title to AI creator. And I think as more like, influencers and creators sort of like adopt it, regardless of how corny some of the execution might be, obviously it's all experimentation, and how like surface level the collaboration of brands may be in the beginning. Certainly when I think last year about a lot of those NFT, like the Tiffany sort of like, I think was it Bored Ape they did the collab with, the NFT collab. But when I think about brands that do like NFT collabs, certainly the execution isn't the best, but ultimately I think that's all like the progression into the kind of like mass market adoption. And I think that underlying infrastructure is critical. So that's actually what's more exciting for me versus the current executions of ideas. Prompt engineer for sure. I mean, I got an Instagram ad actually recently for this person was just selling like an Excel kind of spreadsheet of like Midjourney prompts. Like it's like how to hack Midjourney, and it's like they just sell prompts, which I thought was like super interesting. So, the more the underlying economy and infrastructure is built, the more we're going to see exciting applications. But the application is sort of the lagging indicator, not the leading indicator. And so it's more interesting to look at sort of what's going to be the best predictor of the trajectory versus like the end results. Because by the time you see the end results, it's here already. And so you've missed the curve as far as sort of trying to be ahead of the curve goes.
Yeah, totally. Also, as you said, like the experimentation phase until you get there is the most important part of the thing, right? So, yeah, I just wonder what Sam's opinion is on that. And also, this happens because, as I was mentioning to Sofiane, this happens because people need more and more to expand their virtual personas, right? They need more assets. They need more things to expand their identities. And that's where avatars and the virtual body come into play. And also, this is very interesting, and maybe we can go back in a bit to Sofiane, and because he mentions value signals. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but that's, how your Web3 persona or your online identity gets, the relevance that you want it to have. So I don't want to mix everything here, but yeah, my main point was to get Sam's opinion on virtual avatars and the body and how, that comes into in your field.
Yeah, I mean, I look at digital avatars as being we've been there for a while, in the sense I curate my Instagram profile, or even my Reddit, or all these different platforms where I have maybe not like a very, quote unquote, immersive body in the digital space, but it's still to me something that is really immersive. So just literature in general, or scrolling through Twitter and just reading post, or comments, it feels to me like a very immersive act. In some ways, a different kind of immersion than something like a metaverse. But obviously, I mean, like I'm in 3D, so I can speak to the motion capture element, or even like I've been scrolling through Tony's what you shared, the presentation, and seeing like CodeMiko, beautiful, like wonderful example of somebody taking a really technical act and just turning it into like a whole persona using a fairly affordable motion capture solution, Unreal Engine. It doesn't take like a lot of money to render. So it's something that became really, accessibility is still the big issue. So getting a $400 motion capture suit is a real, even if it's not like a great result, it's still a big headway into that. I'm curious to know, like Tony, because obviously the idea of the metaverse, I've heard it in so many different meetings, and it is the buzzword, and usually it comes as a kind of an idea that no one can really qualify. But we've seen examples of it. We've seen, like, for me, it's VR chat. That's like the best example. I mean, there's Second Life, there's Fortnite. These things already exist in some form, but seeing the dominant form, or is there going to be a dominant form? It's certainly not going to be meta, but something where I guess, yeah, people can immerse themselves in new kinds of bodies. I mean, my prime examples of the most interesting kinds of bodies that you can inhabit are things that are not even close to being humanoid or biological. Something like being a room, or like an object, or something that can, or a gaseous state or something. I mean, it's all forms that, especially in VR, for example, when you're wearing a headset, you don't even need a mocap suit. You can kind of get some pretty preliminary data on how the head moves, how your hands move, and you can kind of like fake the rest, and you'd be surprised at the amount of immersion you can get just from those few points of data. And one of the cool things that you do in VR chat is you put on some kind of avatar. They're all free. They're just like sitting all over the place, or you can kind of create your own, and you look in a mirror. That's like kind of the dominant behavior. You put something on, and there's all these mirrors in the world, and you can kind of like, you make a motion, and then you watch yourself make that motion. You get some kind of one-to-one relationship between you and this new form of this new appendage or something, this new arm, or in the case where you're like a space, a room, or an object. I don't know. It really forces this idea of re-examining your representation as a consciousness or something. It's pretty wild. But anyway, the whole idea of where the digital avatar is going, and whether we're going to realistically see some kind of immersive augmented reality space that's going to be the dominant economic world. It's hard to envision, and I'm just curious to know. I mean, I've been waiting for it and sort of seeing it, but I'm curious to just to see where it's all going, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's interesting when you talk about the expansion of bodies and consciousness, because I think ultimately I don't really have horse in the race when it comes to the ultimate sort of like output or like interface of what the metaverse is. I think it's too early to tell. I think it's actually going to be a startup that doesn't exist yet. I don't think it's currently out there. I think we're just in a lot of early stage experimentation. I think more importantly, though, the idea of the metaverse, which has actually been around for a long time. I mean, I always joke that like Neopets walked so that the term metaverse could like run. Because, here I am back in like middle school, like feeding like my digital pet and like talking to other people and playing games and like networking and basically like LARPing on this online platform. Like the idea of the metaverse in its different forms right now, when we talk about it, like has already existed. I mean, like I'm a huge nerd. I'm big into games. That was like my childhood. And so, I think a lot more about the metaverse as ultimately transmedia or new media layer, probably, like a digital layer that allows us to like fully fragment our identity into a different, almost like, like a new account. Currently, like, in social media, like we have fragmentations of identity, but they're still ultimately like either idealized versions of ourselves or a curated version of ourselves. And I think on the metaverse, the idea that you can become an entirely new person, or you can like fully fragment, it's like very Ghost in the Shell, where like, Kusanagi can like literally put her like cyber brain into a different body and like live differently. Like I remember like reading the Cyborg Manifesto, and like there's that scene from Ghost in the Shell where like Kusanagi's in the shell of a man, and the idea that this like kind of like female cyborg can like operate in this male shell and then like go back to her apartment and go back to her female shell. Like that to me is like kind of ultimately the dream of the metaverse, right? And so I think like to me, like that's the more like metaphysical condition that excites me.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, I think like there are a lot of different like outputs. I think more realistically, video games will continue to be the dominant sort of interface for a lot of metaverse-y things, just because they have critical mass, and it's just the more like kind of game of metaverse interactions is just the more conducive sort of like kind of commercial output that you can actually get people to like engage with. And I think a lot actually when you talk about new modes of consciousness, about like that art trend like over a couple of years ago, like object-oriented ontology, where like artists were trying to like explore the condition of like how we anthropomorphize sort of like non-sentient kind of like objects. And then I think about how video games are so good at that. Like they're like, one of the games that like was a huge hit last year was Stray, where you literally play as a cat. And so like, a lot of video games allow you to kind of like adopt these like non-human, characters. And so, I think all of these things are kind of like linked. But ultimately, I think, yeah, the question of like how our identity is fragmenting is something that is critical to kind of not only the metaverse, but also I think the generational condition of like Gen Z youth. Because I think every subsequent generation will encounter more and more identity fragmentation as more and more of these channels become open and we're so integrated natively into them. So I feel like Gen Z are so good at like code switching and identity switching at rates that like older generations could just never really do. And that's why like everyone talks about like, oh, how Gen Z is so fluid and diverse. But part of it is just that they're so good at switching kind of identities because that's just the technological condition into which they were born.
Yeah, I feel like I'm still I'm still in the old mindset of I prefer anonymity, and I think that like there's looping back to fashion in general. How do you maintain a consistent, or do you need to maintain, or is it interesting to maintain a consistency in your presentation? I mean, I think no. I think it's more interesting to, like you said, code switch and to experiment with completely different forms. Which, if you're not anonymous, if you have to tie it back to an account that's identifiable, it really like stops you from exploring different routes. So I think anonymity is key, and I think that this whole Gen Z look at this kind of like I heard the term post-core recently, and just the idea of embodying so many contradictions as part of your identity, being kind of like a more genuine or authentic portrayal of your lifestyle is super interesting. So yeah, I think anonymity is super interesting as almost as a form of identity. And Sofiane, we talked about that in our last meeting, just the idea of identity being sort of the core value in the economy. But yeah, how it all loops back together, I don't know. All interesting.
Yeah, I think pseudonymity is also an interesting thing to look at. We are moving to a world where you create an avatar. That avatar is like kind of an artist. You know what? When you are an artist, you can, create a new name, and you can, use an artist name, and you build your entire identity. And if you take, for example, like random example, like Lady Gaga, I think one interview she said like, oh, I don't allow like paparazzi and so on, and I'm not playing that game because if they saw me in my day-to-day life, they would be so disappointed. That so she created like this like kind of character, and that's what creates the mystery and so on around it. And I think this kind of like ability to create an identity, an artist version of yourself, is actually now given to anyone online. Anyone can just say, oh, I'm going to create an avatar here with that, and actually I played with that for many years. It was hard for me, but by necessity, to reconcile my life as like fashion week DJ and stuff like that, and then like, being executive in the tech world, and especially in France, which is very formal country. And so I had to like create like different name. And so I have my like, LinkedIn and Instagram and SoundCloud, and those are like completely different worlds. And yeah, like pseudonymity in Web3 is even more interesting because now it's not just like a pseudonymous that you create and that is owned by a corporation like on Instagram, but it's actually something that you can own, and it's a capital, and you can build up on this capital, and then you can launch like many avatars of yourself in Web3. We have seen this a lot with PFPs, and I think this is just going to intensify.
I mean, I think a quick thing on like, anonymity versus sort of, disclosing identity is with the fragmentation of identity across the internet and the metaverse. I think a key part of it is that you have certain identities that are anonymous and certain identities that are not. And so you kind of like operate in these like breaking past the binaries. I think ultimately like that like kind of more fluid way of operating where you can be both this and this, like a more quantum state of being, is I think one of the great opportunities the metaverse allows, because it does allow you to be anonymous, but it also, with soulbound tokens and, other like kind of interesting features in Web3, like allows you to also like stake a claim in your identity and who you are, right? So I think those are both equally valid, but I think anonymity will remain really powerful. I mean, think a lot about Moot when he said like anonymity is the ultimate authenticity. And ultimately, I tend to agree with him, as much as I also, am not anonymous on the internet, and I actually like being able to build an identity on the internet over time.
Yeah, I mean, I think I like the idea of calling it like a superposition of two states, having your anonymous self versus your, outward portrayal into the real world where the consequences exist. It is always a a kind of boundary to keep in check, and it's cool.
Yeah, I think a world with without the ability to create pseudonymous identities would inevitably lead to like a complete hindering of innovation, because innovation is disruption. When you innovate, when you create something new, it means that you are somehow taking away something from people who have a big interest at keeping things the way they are. The same is true in philosophy, in culture, in technology. And so I'm actually quite surprised how open and tolerant Web2 companies are towards Web3, because I think they just laugh for now because they don't take it seriously. You have this whole curve of like, first they ignore you, that's what they were doing, then they laugh at you, which is now, because they look at Web3 and they're like, there is no way this thing is going to get network effect and mass adoption. So, all the Googles and the Amazons of the world are like not really feeling threatened. I think at some point they will start to feel threatened, and I think in general the reason why Satoshi was an avatar, and the reason why, because as an innovator, as a creator, as a disruptor, you have to piss off some very powerful people, and the ability to do that through pseudonymous, I think, is necessary for this evolution of culture and technology.
One more thing I'll just add, because it kind of came to mind about this idea of like identity and fragmentation, is I also think a lot about, kind of like queer theory and sort of like sort of critical theory texts around sort of, around the body, but then reading into it in a Web3 way. So the example I'll use is, Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, right? Because I was actually talking to the people at FWB about it. They have an editorial platform called Work in Progress, and we're just talking to the editors. And, I was like, it's interesting because when I first read it, I was really into the idea of like cybernetics and human machine interfaces and that kind of hardware, and the kind of promise that Donna Haraway had. I mean, I read it more from a kind of transhumanist perspective, and she wrote it from like a radical feminist perspective, but she was sort of like, in a world where you have cyborgs, gender is obsolete. And that is like the ultimate, gesture of sort of like radical feminism. And I was like, in some ways, actually, Web3 is a more kind of like practical and accessible gateway into that sort of like idea of like kind of queer identities, because so much of the queer experience, like speaking from firsthand experience, is like kind of like, shifting identities, having identities, like you've got an identity you present to like your family or to other people before you're, able to come out. For example, when I play video games, I always like role play as like the sexy female assassin. Like I'm always a glass cannon, like always like a dark elf. Like I've got a very specific archetype I like, doing. And so I feel like, so much of like Web3, building digital avatars and having fragmented identities, is the ability to like make role play more than just role play, but actually something that is like a more like not formalized commitment, but something that you go deeper into. And I think that's very much rooted in the queer experience to begin with, because so much of the queer experience is having to build these multiple identities and shift between them as a survival mechanic. And so I think like there's a lot of interesting just queer theory, like kind of like literature that you can just read in a Web3 digital avatar way, not as a way to say that like we should make Web3 more queer, but rather to say that like queer theory can actually help you understand the modalities in which identity can fragment, because those are the realities that queer people have already faced. But the technology allows you to do it in such different ways that actually allow like all kinds of people to like embrace different kinds of identity as like forms of like therapy, exploration, and discovery. And I think that's really exciting as well. And again, it goes back to the idea of transmedia content being powerful in its ability to world build in entirely new ways.
It was really interesting to hear you talk about the metaverse and how also identity mixes up with the internet. And I always feel like the metaverse has always been here, like since Web 1, like, in the internet immerses ourselves into this place where we can be someone else, and it has its own territory dynamics that we can, walk around. And it has been like that since the beginning, right? That's amazing. And right now, with the available resources, Sofiane, you mentioned how Gen Z is a very important demographic as a consumer in Web3. And, them being the most important field of study right now, or demographic study right now, because we're targeting everything for them and we're building this world almost for them, and also bringing them the tools for them to be able to succeed in the creative world. There's these two things that I wanted your take And it's why, the Gen Z is an important demographic right now. And why are we, approaching them so much?
The thing about Gen Z is that it's a generation that's like completely internet native. So I'm one of those last people who still have seen, like I guess in this group, who has seen a world without internet, at least for the first like 15 years. I think there is a level of wisdom that needs to be put into the definition of internet infrastructure, because from an experience level, like there is no difference between, Web 2, Web 1, like it's just, people publishing content, and nobody really thinks about this. We are all used to have ISPs that provide, access to digital content. We have manufacturers. But the difference with software and the difference with Web 2 is that your phone carrier doesn't decide the content you are going to watch. It doesn't decide, if people can access your content, if you can monetize or not, and so on. And there is a great danger that I think Gen Z don't see because they don't have probably the background, and they are very deeply embedded in this like experience of like day to day using social media and using all those platforms, where there is a great danger of like to be a bit, fatalist, that it could end up in like 1984, and we have to build the infrastructure that prevents that. So Gen Z very good at manipulating culture, very good at understanding how to play with technology, extremely smart generation, extremely savvy consumers. I don't think Gen Z are easy to advertise because they don't see like they have this total immunity towards advertising. They just want, the things that are like radical and underground and that are recommended by people they trust. So they are born with this like great immunity that, for example, boomers don't have. Like if you look at boomers on internet, they are like completely the targets of all kinds of scams, and they always fall for it all the time. Like they click everywhere. If it's written click here, they do it. While Gen Z have this like, very high level of immunity to this like native stuff. But yeah, I think it's very important for us to build an infrastructure that understands that the whole container has to be also structurally designed in a way that will enforce, sustainably ethical interaction between the technology operators and the users. And so that's kind of what Newfoundation is excited about to deliver in a way that's like easy to adopt, and in a way that's also in accordance with our, let's say, background and understanding of like cultural production and aesthetics economy and all that.
I have one more question before opening to the audience. I'm really sorry. Maybe we can try to keep it short, but also while you were talking, Sofiane, I'm thinking how irreverent, right, the Gen Z is, and how ironic is the content that they consume. So it makes it like super slippery, right? You don't ever know if they're going to actually like it or make it a weapon against you. So, I'm very curious on Tony's take about memes and platforms and their symbolic meaning in transmedia storytelling.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think like, memes are the language of the internet. And in a post-truth environment, I think the fundamental condition of truth being always presented as being simultaneously like, or facts or messages presented as it is both true and false at the same time is very much just kind of the nature of just how information is being communicated today. And so this sort of like quantum sort of nature of like truth being very destable lends itself well to memes being a very strong kind of like vehicle to transmit information, because of the fact that memes allow you to use humor, especially like nihilistic, absurdist, existential humor, in this very post-ironic way where you can both like laugh at the joke as an outsider, but be part of the joke as an insider, right? I mean, it's why like Balenciaga like is like what it is, right? Like when you like Balenciaga, you are both laughing at the joke and you are the joke at the same time, right? And that's very much kind of like the whole vibe. So, I think the like irony and, for example, even that product campaign, like part of the reason why that campaign did so well is it became a whole meme. Like you were making fun of it, the whole time as well. Like some of those questions I will admit are quite, like kind of the prompts are a little bit ridiculous, like very like kind of like I'm 14 and deep kind of, type of prompts. But, I loved it. I know that product was a little worried. They actually were like, do we think this is a bad thing? I'm like, this is amazing. Like the fact that you are memeing your campaign is like a great success signal. I think ultimately when it comes to brands, I try not to, steer too much into that territory. I mean, with like Sequoia, we did do that. Web3 is a bit different. It's very anti-authoritarian and anti-establishment. So I think it lends itself better. But, I think always when you try to make something more corporate, I try not to like kind of exploit or extract from those kind of cultures and keep them more pure and authentic. You can be opportunistic when the opportunity arises versus trying to engineer it as a company, because I think that's just really disingenuous. And I think that applies to a lot of things. Like, Loire is currently a client, and, we talked a bit about like, do we do an activation where we like partner with like poppy juice, or we do like a drag show, or we, do something related to ball culture. And, Raul was actually very thoughtful, was like, even though I'm from that world, because, Loire ultimately is a company, like to do that feels totally very different. And, there are corporate sponsors as well, like ultimately, like, we don't want to feel like we're extracting from culture. We always want to generate culture. And I think that's a very valuable, like kind of key takeaway. And so anyways, like I'll leave it at that. But I very much think that like it is the language of not just the internet, it's just the reality of where we are today in a post-truth world. And it allows us to like speak in like these sort of like quantum states of like plausible deniability of like we mean it and we don't mean it. And we just kind of wait to see how people react. And then we can be like, yeah, I meant it. Or like, oh, just kidding. It's just a joke. Like, don't get offended.
Sam, do you do memes as a designer?
I consume them like a madman, as we all do. It's interesting, the vehicle of irony and humor to deliver devastating truths, hidden in things like contradictions and conflicts and truths and post-truths. It's weirdly digging at something that's like more, despite them being, very fast and sketchy, they reach some kind of like deep truth in humanity, which I find really interesting. But I think it takes that kind of, it takes irony and humor to get there, to pierce through the heart or to pierce through the soul.
Totally. So I will open the questions to the audience because we could keep on going forever. And I would love to hear some takes. We have some amazing people that joined the meeting. So I will pass the mic to Joy. I see that Domingo has wrote something about anonymity. I don't know if you want to expand a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Dominique. Hi, everyone. I'm drooling over all the ideas and concepts that you guys are sharing. I'm very hyped about all the subjects and concepts you're talking about. And the reason I said about anonymity, that idea is, for example, I like to look over communities or niche that use disguises or cosplaying to represent their identity through their community. So they are basically constructing their identities on objects that are signals, even though they don't have the full costume or the full representation of the character. Maybe with small beacons or small items, they just create this platform to represent other type of identities or ideas among other type of contexts. Because, for example, what happened in Japan in those train stations where on Sundays afternoon, you could go there and be, if you want to be a Lolita, or if you want to be a Pikachu, or if you want to be something else, but Monday through Friday, you work for a bank or something, but still on those contexts, you're carrying some signals or some objects, maybe pins, maybe buttons, maybe you're listening to some podcasts, or you're interacting in other digital communities, constantly expanding your identity, even you're part of a different context. So that's why I like the idea of anonymity through signaling objects to keep recognizing yourself among other peers and so.
For quick background, Domingo is also a creative director at Jump Media and a designer at Valletta Studio Lab, and we've been following for a while. He's been part of the community and he's making amazing designs, and I love where you're going with this, Domingo.
Thank you, Joyce. Also part from Radar, who we create a group for creation of futures and trend forecasting, so I'm very excited to be part of this.
Yeah, totally. I was going to mention Radar, and their research group is extremely relevant. So please also after reading the forecast study from Tony, you jump right into the Radar Futures group. So please do it. That's how the mapping of the after the conversation. So I know Nate has their hand raised.
Hi everyone. Okay. To jump on what Domingo was saying about the example with Japan and thinking back about this amazing conversation that I'm super grateful to witness today. I think the main concept I see out of the transmedia fashion sort of like thinking process is the idea of like fluidity. You know, rather than seeing this concept as like something very rigid where it kind of breaks the barrier between commerce, art, media, and stuff, it feels like there's more movement, more fluidity between the different mediums, between, you know, having that concept of like fragmented identity, and that's super interesting. Really like the idea of fluidity between the different parts of like transmedia fashion is what struck me after hearing that conversation. And it feels like culture itself, not to use the word fashion, but like on the wider spectrum, culture is all about, you know, something that evolves, something that is very fluid, something that uses different channels and different ways of like interacting also with people who are viewing and visioning that culture. It feels like Web3 in that context is sort of allowing this fluidity in a way that we've never like seen before, rather than just, you know, seeing it from a lens of like, oh, innovation, new hardware, new trends, you know. It feels like something much more transcending than that. And that's super exciting. And yeah, just want to thank you, Samuel, Tony, Sofiane, and Dominique for that conversation. It was super insightful. Thank you.
Yeah, we are happy to have you here as well, Nate. And I would also love to hear Gloria's opinion on all of this, who's also the editor at Red Eye. And yeah, I would love to hear, maybe you can introduce yourself quickly.
Yes, hi everyone. I'm very happy to be part of this group, and I learned a lot, and I love to listen to you guys. Yeah, Red Eye is a magazine, so we have like different layers of the way we express and talk about creativity in this very specific age. And so we have like a magazine, but also we do installations in spatial. So we have like a metaverse landscape to install kilometers of installations. And we love to blow up materials and images and creations. So we love the space. I have been working for also like I'm a part of like I'm super boomer. I did leave the 90s when I was working already in fashion at the time. So we didn't have like really internet. And the very first time I actually saw Facebook, I thought no one would ever use it because I thought I hated it. And so that's to say that after so many years, I have been experiencing from analog photography, the way, you know, we were like storytelling fashion. It was through analog photography, and then we went into digital. And then from digital photography, we went into moving image and then fashion film. And now finally, we are in a totally three-dimensional landscape. And I always had the feeling that the interface of computers and mobile phones was like very, like, you know, it was like limiting our perspective on creativity. And also nowadays, it's so mechanical, the way we move around and scroll around content, that nothing really sticks, you know. So maybe it's just because I'm a boomer and I lived in the 90s. And I was very lucky to work with important fashion brands at the time that made history. But to me, everything that was made that time is like still very iconic today. And sometimes I have a really hard time finding a way of what is gonna, you know, iconic in the last 10 years. I don't know, there's not so much. So finally, we have like a new landscape. And with Red Eye, what I hope to do is to try to find a way to work with artists where we find, new iconic moments that can stick in time. And then maybe in 20 years, we will remember oh, do you remember, like in 2020s, what happened? And there's like this major new digital, like fashion design or digital artists or like experiences that are going to build up memories for us to keep, So this is kind of what I'm trying to do. But to me, like thinking about, for example, avatars, like I understand that you can decide to be whoever you want as an avatar. And I'm very fascinated when I find people that are super creative, with the way they are like envisioning themselves in, like virtual landscapes, artificial landscapes. But me personally, I like to be like to find a way to be exactly the way I am. And I'm having a hard time now, like making a distinction, a difference between what we call real and digital is like kind of really the same. And I spend a lot of time with my, Oculus in my head. And I love that. I even dream about being like, I have dreams about being in the metaverse, my, red eye space and building up and moving things around. I have this, hard time to make a distinction. It's like more and more the same. And I feel I am the same in all these different landscapes, what we call a real and what we call artificial. I have a difficult time in making a distinction. It's more and more the same. I feel it's exactly the same because it's the way, I like to spend a lot of time in the digital artificial space. So, the same as I go out and meet friends, but to me it's the same to meet friends, when I'm running around spatial, it's exactly the same. So to me it's really about like for fashion is like finding a way to build up memories and find, who is the new iconic designer that is going to shape the future, that is going to blow up our minds, something that is going to stick in time. I'm a bit afraid that there is such an acceleration in the way we eat up content. So I would love to find a way to create like a new language that is like becoming and shaping the future of fashion, something that is becoming iconic. The same way we remember, in the 90s, those collections of Comme des Garçons or Margiela or, Alexander McQueen, that kind of feelings of being at those shows. I would like to find new ways to have these kind of impactful memories that are going to stick in time.
So how would you define Laureate Transmedia Fashion from your perspective? And where do we find like the next intersection of what you would say like a Margiela had or a special kind of like the special sauce in transmedia fashion?
And I think we still need to find it, and somehow we need to create also like a network that is like, supporting these new designers, because like a lot of time I see maybe there is like great creative minds, but then it's very difficult for them to keep up the work, because everyone is doing so many jobs at the same time. I mean, it's very difficult to create even like, correct economical environment that it's like supporting, creativity. It's very complicated. I still see that it's like very difficult. So maybe through crypto, we're going to be able to really, through DAOs, find a way to support financially, even like young designers. But somehow at the moment, I don't see this like happening, The same way, like for designers that are like, creating, like young designers creating collections, like physical collections, it's very difficult for them to keep up. So I've seen here, even I'm from Milano, I live in Milano, and I've seen there is like some amazing young designers, but are struggling to survive, it's very, very difficult for them. So I'm thinking, how can we ensure that actually this creativity can be supported financially as well? Very complicated. So somehow like we have to find a way, I hope like with Red Eye, we just launched it in September and we try to showcase and give a voice to a lot of creators. Hopefully Red Eye is becoming more like well-known, so that we can have a voice and try to stir up, like conversations around these young talents, so that we can support them even more. But like institutional wise, I see that there is still a lot of problems, like there is not enough support for young designers and young creative minds.
Yeah, totally. And drawing that to Tony, like who also has so much experience in that, like how do you create like this cultural moment from your perspective that is not just like fading or interrupted, but how do you create like a long-lasting moment for brands? Tony, I would love to know more.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's just about creating longer term narratives. It's nothing really that revolutionary, but brands need to stand for something more so, today than ever before. And they can't just put rhetoric out there for rhetoric's sake. They have to really materially invest in it. So, brands have to really stand behind what they mean and build meaningful narratives, whether those are creative cultural narratives or bigger ones beyond that. I actually tend to think that fashion is not so great at this. Fashion obviously also sells fantasy, and the nature of that fantasy has changed from one rooted in a lot of like Eurocentric sort of notions of like very post-colonial notions of like status. And where we are now today, it's less about status signaling of your social class and a lot more about your taste and your values. I actually think brands outside of fashion typically do better at it. And, ultimately it's about having the clarity and substance in having like a narrative that is meaningful. And it can't just be sort of like Silicon Valley platitudes, because I think tech has also been really bad at just putting like really just like saccharine kind of like we're changing the world through X, Y, and Z, but what the fuck does that really mean? And I think a lot of Web3 brands are doing it in interesting ways. Like Uniswap is a client, and work with them on their brand. And, their mission is to unlock universal value in exchange. And, working with them to really think through, well, what does that really mean? And, totally agree that, bigger brands should be investing in younger brands or kind of investing in the sector they're in, whether it's culture or Web3 or whatnot. What I like is that, even before I worked with Uniswap on evolving their brand, they already had a grants program, right? And that grant came from like, that was a governance thing. Like it came from like a vote. They created a grants program. And then they had all these like kind of fun projects where they actually, funded it with the token. So what I like is they put, the money where their mouth's at. And I think that's an important thing for a lot of, bigger brands as well. And that certainly is a very revolutionary gesture in fashion, right? Like I remember with Prada, we did have an idea because they were asking about like diversity and inclusion. And, they're asking like, for Black History Month, should we be doing something? And one of the ideas I just put out was like, hey, just like spotlight Black designers and like invite them, like do a like Nietzsche and Raft talks to like, Grace Mills Bonner or Telfar, and just like kind of like spotlight them, or even like as a crazier gesture, do a capsule collection or like product in your stores, which like, I don't think they've ever bought that, but at least got them thinking, right? And sometimes you have to be kind of like extreme to one end to get brands, because they're going to compromise. And so at least if you start from like a farther place, like you'll end up somewhere more in the middle. But yeah, ultimately it's about having an impactful narrative that has some kind of meaning and value, has to have substance, and then materially investing in it and actually like making that a reality, not just like a rhetoric, not just like putting Kendall Jenner in a Pepsi ad. Like that's not enough to, convince people.
It kind of reminds me of cloud bombing. From what I understand, cloud bombing is this unauthentic way brands are taking like a big brochette of like influencers who are famous, putting them together in one campaign and like kind of packing them because they all have like the perfect demographic group, but they have nothing in common. It feels disingenuous. It feels like kind of artificial, and they kind of like force the creation of like tribes that don't really, plus also with this like right kind of composition of like, diversity of ethnicities and so on. And it just feels like corporate and kind of like, not really authentic.
But it's also gaming the algorithm as well, I'm assuming, right? So it's proliferating the information by making it viral by engineering or something. Yeah, I mean, there's a function for it. So I mean, I get it, but yeah.
Exactly, and I think it's part of this, topic about Gen Z that are super immune to like all forms of manipulations in culture and so on. And I think that, there is this like reaction to it, which is if you see suddenly like all those like kind of Kim K type of influencers, like superstars, all together in one campaign, it feels like repulsive because you are like kind of being, manipulated. And yeah, that's super interesting.
I mean, culture has always been reactive and in some ways really cyclical. So, there's always like a reaction to kind of like what like is like kind of the dominant paradigm or the narrative or the trend, and then sort of a a reactionary sort of like subcultural move to kind of either reject it or respond to it. And then certainly with like the algorithm, trying to game it or hack it or break it is very much a thing. And I think it works, in both directions, both as a way to try to like get more clout, but then also as a way to actually resist the algorithm. I increasingly people are adopting like anti-metric behaviors where they're doing things specifically that will actually get their post to not do as well. There's like this like trend where people are basically posting something on Instagram, immediately archiving it, and then waiting a couple of days later to repost it back so that it basically skips your feed and only appears in your grid. So you basically guaranteed that it will not get great engagement, but it's almost like on purpose. And so ultimately, like everything is reactionary. Things like a reaction to something, but I definitely think that that's like something that we see playing both ways. And of course, trying to game the system to, break the, to like, for example, like, like let's get a bunch of famous people and put them in one campaign together just to like kind of try to like gain as much traction. That's nothing new either. I mean, Calvin Klein does it quite well with their In My Calvins. At this point, the strategy is just to pick anyone with over 1 million followers and you'll eventually appear. If you're hot enough and you've got over 1 million followers, you will eventually be in like a Calvin Klein, campaign. But then you've got independent creators like, Eric Hu, who is a graphic designer, and worked with him closely when I was back at Essence. He actually, like during the protests in 2020 on Black Lives Matter, he had this whole like, I think it was on police brutality and violence, but he basically created like a carousel of assets or like resources, but he designed it to look like a happy-go-lucky, cheerful like infographic. And he even wrote in the thing like he's basically trying to hack the system by creating something that looks like a specific thing, so it'll get more engagement, but wanted to use it as a way to Trojan horse important information as a resource for the community. So again, I think everything works in every which way, and you can find examples of it being used, on an independent level, on a corporate level, like as a thing to try to like kind of promote it or as a kind of counter reaction to it. So.
Yes, I think a lot of that also can be linked to like the recent drama, especially like last quarter of 22 with like Kanye and Balenciaga and so on. Like it's too much of like controversy, too much of, trying to attract attention at all costs. And people, they just said, okay, stop. Now we're gonna like, flip it the other way around and we will be super outraged and like make it like turn against this. And I think the machine that used to work of like using social media to just like create controversy and create, this like polarization, I think now people are also reacting against that, it feels.
I want to quickly take a moment and Hugo, if you're still here, with also you with your experience, quickly share your insights and join the convo. I know you have such a wide background and I would love to hear your vision or like your insights on the whole brand thing right now.
Hey guys, great to be here. I'm Hugo, graphic designer, creative director, doing this since also over 15 years now, started pretty early. Have a lot of interesting crossroads with Tony also. I'm supporting Newfoundation since over a year now. Crazy. Time flies. It's for me always interesting, let's say in my profession, it's very 50-50. So I'm working with clients since a long time. I've worked for big and small agencies, but always returned to independency. And now I'm focusing a lot, like my main, let's say, partner is Newfoundation with all the different brands, trying to make everything, having a big red thread through the whole ecosystem, but also developing each brand with its own unique identity and unique soul. At the same time, I'm running my own brand and own magazine, All Present. And it's really interesting how always these two poles in my life always feed each other and nurture each other. We're kind of helping realize the vision of a team that I'm also part of, and then kind of my baby or my personal brand, and how this is really nurturing each other, and they're all going in the same direction. I'm trying to just like take everything in like a sponge, also especially when it comes to all the new technology. I think for me the interesting part is really how we can encourage people that build stuff. So I'm all about empowering makers, and that's why also I got drawn so much to Newfoundation and Newcoin, because ultimately, and also Web3, like this is why I find this so fascinating, because how can we make this all a bit more fair and also a bit more, fun in a good way. And it was really, really inspiring for me to hear about all this, and I would take it in and will spread it.
yeah, Hugo is like our creative source. Like we really just appreciate having him here, and we're definitely gonna bring him back on when we are like starting new questions and new panels.
Yeah, let's say, so we went over time, but with a lot of pleasure. I feel this has been one of the most insightful conversations I had in a while, besides, reading and going through spiraling and rabbit holes on my own and the team, but, it's been very, very amazing. So one last question to close up is whoever wants to go is, what do you see coming? Like, what's the next thing that is happening?
We are coming in waves.
I'll just jump in and say, because this could be a whole separate panel, but I guess one prediction that I'm excited about is my belief that the next $1 billion startup will not be a startup, but a creator. And I think as the creator stack gets much more robust, and as sort of creators evolve and mature their sort of like revenue streams. I mean, I read a stat that like in the past 2 or 3 years, the majority of revenue now, or like the plurality majority, is not from advertisements, it's from merch and other sort of like revenue lines. And as the financial stack also gets more in favor of creators in terms of like loans and sort of like commercialization, yeah, I think the next $1 billion startup will be a creator. So I'll just put that there, because I think that that's a pretty interesting one to kind of keep an eye out for.
I was just gonna say, it feels like the technology is gonna enable some kind of like organic way of presenting our identity, who we are aligned, and just culture our world. To go back to my point about fluidity and how it's something that is like multi-dimension, multimedia, it feels like we were up until, well, now, and so we're not even there, kind of limited by the way we could portray this worldwide and like seamlessly and stuff. And it feels like now we're like, hyper technology is bringing us back to some kind of organic truth, if that makes any sense. We're able to be like fully fluid and multifaceted, just like culture is, just like people are. So excited for that.
Thank you everyone for being here. This was amazing, beyond expectations.
Yeah, so thank you everyone. This was like absolutely unbelievable conversations, and it's the kind of conversations we've been having amongst the team for years now. For example, with New Life, we really started to think conceptually about how transmedia fashion plays a part in your whole experience, and what a new type of social media would be. And maybe even, losing the word social is the first thing to do, because it's a new type of social that's emerging. It's about aesthetics, and it's about how do you relate to concepts, and how do you experience the story that is behind a creator or a brand. And so really thinking about transmedia fashion has helped us to evolve in terms of designing products and designing Web3 app experiences and dApps, and working with different startups across different programs that we have. With NEWFORUM, with New Moon, for example, we see this evolving, and it's not just us who've been thinking this way. It's the whole ecosystem of people who get it and who understand that transmedia fashion applies not only to fashion, but it applies even to app design. And so with Hugo, for example, we're working a lot on newlife.io and what is going to be this new experience of transmedia fashion as an app, as a new profile that you have, and how are people going to relate to that. Really, the next big thing is going to be the creators individually, and creating that financial stack is what it's all going to be about to enable that to happen. So yeah, really welcome everybody to keep contributing to this research and development. So we do hear the research part, right? But behind the scenes, everyone's developing amazing things. So thank you. And to just close this up, please join us next time. And thank you from NEWFORUM for letting us host this session.